Welcome, everyone. I'm Marcia Brewster. I'm the Vice President of UNA Westchester, and I'm very happy to welcome you today to UNA Westchester's celebration of International Women's Day 2022. Our president, Jan Edwards, could not be with us today, unfortunately, but he's with us in spirit. Our program today, the theme of the day is Women Leaders for Climate Action. And we'll start with a video that highlights a young woman, Vanessa Makate, a leading young voice for climate activism. May we have the video?
Climate change is more than statistics. It's more than data points. It's more than net zero targets. It's about the people. It's about the people who are being impacted right now. When it comes to the African continent, it's of course on the front lines of the climate crisis, but it's not on the front pages of the world's newspapers. When you talk about poverty eradication, you look at how the climate crisis is pushing millions of people into poverty traps and keeping it, for generations and generations, because as families try to, go out of poverty through maybe selling the food that they grow on their farms, then the climate crisis is destroying many people's crops, drying up many people's crops through the droughts and also through the floods, destroying people's farms, floods destroying people's businesses. So it will be impossible to eradicate poverty without climate justice. In many societies, girls and women are the front lines of the climate crisis, and they're the first responders, when climate disasters occur, because in many societies, they have the responsibility of providing food for their families, collecting water, for their families, and, collecting firewood for their families. So many times, what is lost on the farm is hard work of one woman or many women, in a certain community. The people who have to walk long distances, this could be a woman, having to walk long distances to look for water because of the water scarcity. This could be someone's, girl child who is going to drop out of school to help their mother collect water or to recover everything that has been lost on the farms. I think it's important for people to look at climate change in that, in that lens, to see that it's more than emissions. It's more than 1.5. It's about how people are being impacted when it comes to education, when it comes to gender equality, when it comes to poverty, when it comes to hunger, when it comes to peace, when it comes to their health as well. So I think one of the ways that we can ensure that people start seeing that is to educate more people and to create more awareness about people understanding that if it is a puzzle, as long as one piece is not okay, everything else, the puzzle can never be complete. And if it's a system, if one part of a system is crushed or it's broken, then eventually the rest of the system will be broken as well.
Thank you very much to Vanessa for those words and all the interrelationships between climate change and gender that we'll be talking about today. International Women's Day has been celebrated on March 8th since 1975, when it was designated as a specific UN day by a UN resolution. It will be commemorated at the UN on Tuesday. Our theme today reflects the priority theme of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, which will be meeting later this month in New York. That theme is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. Advancing gender equality in the context of climate change and disaster risk reduction is one of the greatest global challenges of the 21st century. Climate change has had and will continue to have severe and lasting impacts on our environment, economic, and social development. While women are among the most vulnerable to climate change, they are also powerful and effective leaders and change makers for climate adaptation and mitigation. They are involved in sustainability initiatives around the world, and their participation in leadership results in more effective climate action. Without gender equality today, a sustainable future for all of us remains beyond our reach. We have with us two outstanding women leaders who are at the forefront of organizing an effective and collective response to climate change. And we have Dr. Belinda Miles, president of Westchester Community College, who will be here to moderate the session. The United Nations Association of the USA is a grassroots member organization and network of over 135 campus and community chapters all over the country. It mobilizes Americans, including members of Congress, to support the principles and work of the United Nations. UNA USA is the largest network of advocates and supporters for the United Nations in the world, with over 22,000 members. Our Westchester chapter is involved in public programs such as the one today, and education programs, including Model UN and advocacy. If you're not yet a member, please join UNA USA and our chapter. The link will be put in the chat box. Introductory membership is only $25 per year, and student membership is free. I would like to mention two of UNA USA's current activities that are of relevance to us today. UNA is sponsoring a campaign to get the US to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is CEDAW. Since 1979, the US has become one of only 6 countries who have not yet ratified CEDAW, and is in the company of Iran, Somalia, Sudan, and 2 small island countries. Our chapter, our Westchester chapter, has been working on the creation of an advisory group on the implementation of CEDAW in Westchester County, following a resolution on this subject by our County Board of Legislators. A UNA event in support of the US ratification of CEDAW is being held on March 14th at the beginning of CSW. A link to that program will be put in the chat box. Another campaign is related to the situation in Ukraine. As you know, the General Assembly passed a historic resolution on Wednesday, demanding Russia's end to the invasion of Ukraine and withdrawal of its military forces. Today, demonstrations are taking place all over the world in support of the people and families in Ukraine. UNA USA is advocating support to UN agencies directly, in particular, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA, and its Ukraine Humanitarian Fund. OCHA is working in Ukraine and on its borders to provide critical assistance to the Ukrainian people. The link to the fund will be put in the chat box. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Links Incorporated, Westchester County, and Greater Hudson Valley chapters, in particular, Jackie Boucher and Leslie Sorrell, for their support of this event, as well as the UNA Southern New York State Division. I also want to express our appreciation for the hard work of the program committee led by Nicole Butterfield and Colleen Gardefay. Finally, I want to give special recognition to one of our chapter's most active young leaders, Harshita Shet, who will receive Volunteer New York's 2022 Youth Leadership Award on April 8th in White Plains. She is a senior at Woodlands High School and has been working with our chapter for many years. We are very proud of Harshita and her humanitarian work in her community and beyond. Harshita, are you in the room?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Harshita, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Hello, everyone, and I'm Harshita. As Marsha mentioned, I'm a senior at Woodlands High School, and I am receiving this award because of my drive-in campaign, Feminine Dignity, which is for feminine hygiene product awareness and collection. I would also like to begin by thanking UNA USA, specifically Marsha Brewster, President Edwards, Patrick Sharada, and Joan Caton, and Young Professional Group for helping me since 2018 when I first came about with the idea, for both believing in me and supporting me in all my endeavors. Even though I am going to college next year, I still will be continuing my services and will be a part of the UNA USA forever. I would also like to thank India Center Westchester, the town of Greenburgh, and Westchester County, and all of my well-wishers for keeping me motivated and determined to making the world a better place. My parents always taught me about giving back to those who are less fortunate. Whenever you have the capability, help without hesitation, which influenced me to start volunteering. With all of the support and dedication, we are able to help those in need and ultimately continue my final goal to make this a global issue of lack of feminine hygiene products known to the world and get us closer to finally overcome this and have no woman or girl struggle to have their own feminine dignity. And thank you all again.
Thank you, Harshita. You've been a great asset to our young professionals and our youth program. Now, before we begin our exciting program for the day, I would like to mention that the program is being recorded and that you should place any questions you have for either speaker into the chat box. A Q&A discussion will follow the dialogue among our speakers and the moderator. Now, I am very happy to turn the program over to Nicole Butterfield to begin the introduction of our guests today. Nicole, you have the floor.
Thank you, Marsha. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nicole Butterfield. I'm a program co-chair at UNA Westchester, and we're thrilled to have a representative from UN Women here today, despite what a busy time it is for them in these days leading up to a new session of the Commission on the Status of Women. I'm pleased to introduce you to Carla Kraft, the Policy Specialist of Sustainable Development within the Economic Empowerment section of UN Women in New York. For the past 8 years, her sustainable development work has focused on gender-responsive green-blue economies, climate change and feminist action for climate justice, women's access to land, water, sustainable energy, and climate-resilient agriculture, among other topics. Prior to joining UN Women, Carla worked for the International Labor Organization in Santiago, Chile, where she worked on labor markets, social protection, and domestic workers' rights. She holds a master's degree in international development from New York University, and we're really thrilled to have her here today. Welcome, Carla. And now I will turn the floor over to Dan.
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you, Nicole. It is my genuine honor to introduce a woman named Tenzin Selden. Tenzin graduated top of her class at Stanford University. She went on to be the first Tibetan American Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford. So I would be remiss not to say happy Losar, the Tibetan New Year, the year of the water tiger, and send all best wishes to her and everyone in attendance here today. Tenzin has seen, experienced, and developed solutions to the diverse impacts on people who are subject to mass migration. It's one of her passions, and I would say it's one of her life's callings. She's been a social entrepreneur, integral to technology and people-centered solutions to climate change for over a decade and a half. Before that, she served as senior advisor and board member to Earth's Call Fund in partnership with Lever for Change. That's when I first met Tenzin. She worked at the United Nations Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, where our own chapter vice president, Marsha Brewster, served for many years. And she also was with the United Nations Environment Program, where she monitored and recommended policy for the region's disaster relief efforts. So no doubt that will enrich the dialogue with our other discussant here today. She is a climate leader and solutionist whose work has been recognized around the world. Now that is what you can find on Google. That's her bio. What you can't find on Google is this, because I troubled with how can I make this personal, and I went back to a leadership framework that I recently developed. I call it the 5H framework for purpose-based leadership. And those 5 H's are your head, which is intelligence and imagination, your hands, which is getting your hands dirty and doing the work, your heart, which is empathy and compassion, humility, which is modest self-importance, which unfortunately is a luxury with many leaders today, humanity, which is broader social conscience. And the reason I brought that up is because Tenzin exemplifies every single one of those H's. And it is really a pleasure that she is able to be a discussant today. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jackie Boucher, who will introduce our facilitator.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce Dr. Belinda S. Miles. She is the third president, first female president of the Westchester Community College, the State University of New York's first Hispanic serving institution and the largest college in Westchester County, New York. The college serves more than 26,000 students annually and is one of the nation's largest metropolitan regions. During her 7-year tenure, President Miles has led teams to nearly double. She has doubled the graduation rates and improved college readiness, increase in retention, achieve unprecedented fundraising levels. And as a local and nationally regarded leader, President Belinda Miles advocates for workforce development, economic mobility, humanistic approaches to technology integration, and community colleges as a discipline, innovation, and academia that fosters an equitable and inclusive democracy. She is a recognized thought leader in community college education. President Miles leads teams at Westchester Community College that provide pathways for all members of our community who seek higher education and access to economic mobility. President Belinda Miles firmly believes that community colleges are places that reflect the democratic ideals of equity, inclusion, and access for all. It is my pleasure to introduce my link sister, Dr. Belinda S. Miles.
Thank you so much, Jackie. It's a pleasure to be here with each of you this afternoon. And I am certainly grateful to the Westchester chapter of the Links Incorporated. I'll take a moment to acknowledge our president, Hillary Fleming, who is joining us from the Westchester chapter on this afternoon's program. And to also thank the UNA Westchester chapter for your vision in bringing this program to fruition in celebration of International Women's History today. And so I thank you, Marcia and Nicole and Dan and Leslie, all of you for the planning, the weeks of planning that we've engaged in. And I'm so excited to be here with our thought leaders, our guests today, Tenzin Selden and Carla Kraft. We have some wonderful information to share. They have wonderful information to share. Tenzin, I just want to do a shout out. I know that you're a community college graduate and speak very passionately about that. So let's just get started by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you even became aware of the climate change situation and the need for climate action. Tenzin, since I put you on the spot, why don't you go start and we'll move over.
Thank you, President Belinda Miles. I also thank you to UNA for organizing this such important dialogue, to Dan Benna for reaching out to me and to Nicole for organizing it. I am a very proud community college student, and it's actually one of the few pathways, Belinda, that I feel exist in a rare country like America that gives people a second chance. So a little bit about myself is I come from a very atypical home in the Himalayas, 14 to 15,000 feet high. My family were nomads. So every 6 months they would graze the land and move to another area. So we, as indigenous to the land of Tibet for generations, learned to live with the land. And it wasn't until the invasion of my country that my family was forced to flee. For 4 months, they walked on foot. I lost half of my family members in that journey. And we arrived in America only after a green card lottery, after spending over 2 to 3 decades in India. India was one of the first places that gave us refuge. And it was also the first place that I understood about the effects of climate, because, my family in Tibet were secluded from a lot of the direct impacts early on. I saw the water, the snow melting, and I saw the water receding every year. And I always asked, like, what is happening with the playgrounds? And every year I would get the same answer. And the answer would be the gods are wrathful and they're angry with us. And I thought the gods couldn't be angry with us every single year. That they take away our homes, they take away our playgrounds. And it's unfortunate that even though I was directly impacted by climate change, I didn't have the words and lexicon for what was happening until a green card lottery and I came to America. And it was in high school in 10th grade in geography class that I learned the term climate change. And that's when it immediately hit me that that's what's been happening in my country. That it's not because of the gods and their anger and wrath upon us, but it's because of human activity that is leading to these mountains, these precious sacred mountains that are melting. And I thought, if I and my family has impacted versions of that, I can't even imagine other people in other parts of the world. And so I devoted my life to studying climate migration and to studying not only the effects of climate change, but the solutions around it. So I founded multiple companies in this field and really believe that the voices of the minority will be the solutions that we need, that we almost have to go back to the indigenous way of living and doing and being to find the present solution.
Tenzin, that's a very personal narrative that you've shared. And when you visualize it and are able to depict and see what's happening within your lifetime, it does indeed help invoke the passion that you seem to have brought into your career. Carla, how did you come to your concerns about climate change and the action that we need to take?
First, thank you, Dr. Miles, and thanks to UNA and Nicole for the invitation. It is quite an honor and a privilege, particularly to be on this panel with Tenzin, and thank you very much for sharing that story. While I don't have quite that similar impact and the experience, I did have a similar trajectory of not having the lexicon until later in life. But I would say that I was always conscious of sustainability and environmentalism, particularly being from a rural agricultural state in middle of America and growing up for a few years on the Standing Rock Reservation, where issues of land are obviously front of mind. Furthermore, my relationship with sustainability, coming from a family that it may have been perhaps due to economics, but we lived a very low waste lifestyle. I think many can relate to reusing Ziplocs and really using thrift stores as our kind of shopping mecca. But it was once I got into college that while my focus really was on social and economic justice, there was again another linkage with sustainability and sustainable development writ large because of working with, for example, corporate accountability, international campaigning on access to water and water rights, as well as looking along the coffee supply chain and seeing the impacts at each level, the both social, economic, and environmental justice issues that are along these supply chains. And then when I got to grad school, that was where I really was able to connect my agricultural state background and food security and nutrition. And it was within this context of looking at food systems that I was really able to engage and understand that our everything from our food to our water is impacted by climate change, and that we must take action. And this has led me to kind of link together the work on economic justice and gender equality and climate action.
Wow, each of you have such powerfully packed intros from your initial views of climate change to your formative experiences, both educationally and in your careers. Can you tell us what you're working on now, what you're passionate about, and what excites you about directions that we're heading in? Carla, would you pick up on your comments and let us know? Then we'll switch over to you in a moment, Tenzin.
Thanks so much, Dr. Miles. Yes, well, my current work actually covers quite a broad range of areas, and climate justice and climate action is one of them, because my work focuses on sustainable development, which includes then the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, gender equality being one of them. But we really work on, because I thanks Nicole for mentioning that I sit within the economic empowerment section. So a lot of my lens has been through, in particular, women's access to resources, and the work that I have been the privilege to work on is women's rights, women's land rights, access to water and sanitation. It was really interesting to hear Harshita about menstrual hygiene management is also an area. And more recently, the deepening work on blue economy and oceans is probably one of the areas that excites me the most, particularly with its hugely important linkage with climate change and the ability for healthy oceans, or the necessity of healthy oceans in order to have, mitigate impacts and adapt to climate change. So I would say that that's kind of the thing that excites me a lot as far as the thematic area and the linkage with climate change. But I would also say that what excites me the most is what terrifies me the most. And that's that we are certainly at a precipice. We're at a turning point in the history of our existence and the sustainability of our planet. It excites me and energizes me to see that the youth are rising, that we have forums like today and discussions and dialogue and action is happening. But as we'll discuss later, that action terrifies me, may not be fast enough. So I will stop there and thank you.
Thanks, Carla. Tenzin, what are some of the projects you're working on currently?
Yeah, I think, for me, I took a turn from, working in the public sector and public markets to understanding the private markets. I feel oftentimes with climate change, the majority of the burden and responsibility, Belinda, is placed on individuals. It's the poor people who have to ask, what are we doing for climate? Whereas in the majority of the carbon emissions is produced by corporations and by large entities like developed countries. So we need to take the responsibility. So I thought there is no better nexus to go than to go in the heart of private sector America. And as an entrepreneur, I have founded multiple companies, some of which have been acquired. Most recently, I founded a company with an incredible developer named Leela Gorin in Yonkers, actually, our own Westchester County, where we are taking the old abandoned station that is in the Glenwood Power Plant. And we are taking that along with the manor, and we're redeveloping both of those sites to be a place where net negative emission can be achieved. I think we need to stop with standards that are just enough. That's what we do with the corporate world. Okay, we have enough of a blueprint, let's go with it. No, net neutrality for buildings are about 42% of emissions in the air. It's one of the largest emitter groups, and yet nobody tackles developers. Nobody tackles people who create steel plants, cement, windows, and yet that is causing majority of our pollution in this planet. So if we build a net negative building, a building that can actually generate enough clean energy, we don't have to worry about 42% of our emission reliance. And so we're showing that this model is possible, Belinda, and that it's possible to do it in a cost-effective way in Yonkers. The other thing that I'm working on as an advocate and leader in this field is to make sure that women are getting funded. Only 2% of climate funding goes to women. And women of color, it's a significantly smaller portion. It's a decimal point. We are a decimal point of funding. And if we don't change the way the funding structure works, we will never change the pathways of which solutions are on the table. And so I'm in the process of right now working with other high net worth individuals to see how can we change the structures of funding for women who are working in this space, and women of color who've been working for generations and eons. They've been taking these indigenous wisdom that we need to now apply.
Well, Tenzin, your comments certainly bring us back to the point that Marcia made in her introductory remarks regarding the Commission on the Status of Women and their upcoming 66th session that will be held here soon in New York. Their priority theme is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. And certainly our program today reflects this important theme. Carla, can you explain why the theme is so important and the connection between women's empowerment and climate change?
Absolutely, Dr. Miles, and thanks so much. Yes, we are heading straight into the Commission on the Status of Women, which is the primary intergovernmental body that focuses on gender equality. And it's really obviously timely, but so important that we get to have the opportunity to bring together governments to talk about this, which is directly following COP. This is the first time that the Commission on the Status of Women will be touching these areas. So it's really an opportunity, because what comes out of the Commission on the Status of Women are what we call the agreed conclusions. And while they're not binding, they are an opportunity for continued advocacy and on the ground work, because we can hold them account to what they agreed upon. But echoing Marcia's opening remarks, really gender inequality coupled with the climate and environment crises are our greatest sustainable development challenges of our time. Really, climate change, the rapid biodiversity loss, desertification, land degradation, and pollution, also coupled with the COVID-19 crisis, have really accelerated and intensified into widespread and interlinked crises that have distinct and disproportionate effects on women and girls. And as Tenzin is sharing, there's an intersectional approach. There is a differing and again a distinct layering of the discriminations and vulnerabilities that women are facing. And we know also that gender inequality really denies full human rights, full enjoyment of human rights to half the population. And this is partly due to women's limited access to public services, social protection, and infrastructure, as Tenzin has highlighted. Also care, which we're really seeing due to COVID, energy, transportation, water. These are all areas that expose women's livelihoods to the impacts of climate, environmental disasters, and constrain then their ability to cope and to respond in the context of these crises and disasters. One thing we know is clear is that we cannot meet the Paris Agreement goal of keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees without taking on board all the solutions and voices from all genders, including women and girls, in all their diversity. Just lastly, women and girls' participation and leadership in addressing climate change and environmental degradation is not only a matter of equality and justice, but we also now have emerging evidence that it leads to more effective, comprehensive, and inclusive responses and solutions. So this year's the priority theme of CSW is so important, and we hope that everyone can send us really great energy so that we do have agreed conclusions coming out. Thank you.
And I hear you referencing evidence-based practice, and it's really natural to enumerate the many areas of intersection. And data is obviously at the core of how we will measure and inspect what we expect and hold ourselves accountable. Tenzin, you were recently the co-founder and CEO of the unique company, I believe you referenced The Plant here in Westchester. And its website describes it as an ecosystem where leading climate innovators, artists, scientists, nonprofit leaders, and companies can co-create lasting solutions for the climate crisis. And again, it's really easy to look at the data and the various categories that are impacted, but can you tell us a story of how genuine co-creation of solutions can lead toward a common goal that works? What does that look like?
Yeah, Dr. Miles, before I share on that, I think I have to press, Carla, your point about, people often think that adding Indigenous voices or women voices is a favor that you're doing to someone or to a community, but it's actually not a favor. It's a necessity at this point. When we're at a brink where we only have less than a decade left until the environmental challenges are irreversible, we need to make sure every voice is included. And there has been data also that has found that when you add women and girls at the center of climate disaster prevention, then you get less children who drop out of college or school. So there is a direct link with poverty, education, and climate change. And girls and women's education are at the center and heart of this problem. So I just wanted to be, emphasize my colleague's point here. In terms of Dr. Miles, The Plant, I think one of the most important ways for us to move forward is that we have to start collaborating with each other. Since I have been part of the climate movement for over 15 years, one of the things I have continually noticed is that it is a stratified conversation, that every single organization has its own approach. So you get the majority large international organizations and they have their climate approach. You get the private sector and they have their climate approach. And we come together maybe once or twice a year, Carla, you can agree on this, at the UN and other conferences, and we hold ourselves to these immeasurable goals. But then we don't have the proximity, and proximity is power. When you get to work with each other, near each other, and be in the same physical environment, the products that you build later on are much better. It's like what I say, when you have diversity on day one, it's much more different than having diversity on day 1,000. So we believe that incorporating physical spaces where we can bring scientists together, where we can bring artists together who are working on climate change, social justice warriors, when we have them in the same room, the conversation by nature and the products by nature that we're co-creating are different. And that has already proven itself. For example, when we have combined AI and artificial intelligence artists who have worked on AI, and we've combined them with Indigenous wisdom, we are now getting online artificial reality art that is based in climate change, storytelling that's based in climate change. So by itself, the nature of the products are changing. And that's why we really believe that it's important to have these co-created communities and proximity, so that we're not just coming together only once a year and discussing climate change, but this is part of our ether. This is part of our DNA from day one.
Thank you for that, Tenzin. I want to just kind of drill down on some of the more practical types of experiences and outcomes, as we heard from that priority theme, that disaster risk reduction policies and programs is also part of what we're anticipating at the forthcoming CSW. And so we're talking about gender inequity here, and women in many circumstances have de facto become the first responders in disaster situations, as they're more likely to be taking care of the household, the people who are going out to gather water, taking care of children and animals. So what can you say about some of the ways that we can best prepare women and girls for these roles, particularly if they have limited education and resources? So either of you, any thoughts about that type of preparation? Tenzin, you want to take a stab at that?
I think Carla should take a stab at that because this is her expertise, but I'm happy to, add on.
Well, let's jump right in, Carla.
Excellent. Yes. So we're really pleased that disaster risk reduction is among the three focus areas of this year's commission. And disaster risk reduction is a relatively newer area for UN Women, but we have burgeoning expertise that are working in a lot of different countries. And early warning systems is certainly one thing that they're working on with governments, but also with the World Meteorological Organization, and that to bring that down on a practical level, and building on Tenzin's point about the linkage with education, if oftentimes disasters are happening in areas that are marginalized and people living in more vulnerable situations, they may not have had the education to be able to have the information they need to prepare for disasters. And so in moments of disaster, for example, if there needs to have an ability to communicate that's not necessarily through written means, and to have information that's just more accessible to those who may be illiterate. So that's one kind of concrete example of the work that UN Women is doing, is working to make early warning systems and the prevention more inclusive and understanding and bringing in those intersections that we need to think about as far as prevention and the preparedness. And then the response is also, of course, kind of building on Tenzin's earlier point, finance is a huge part of this. There needs to be able to have, but not just finance in the recovery linked, for example, to COVID-19, those finance need to have a gender responsive lens. So I saw Tenzin was going to jump in there, so go ahead.
No, I was going to say that it reminded me, Carla, that the universal design principles need to be applied throughout every process of disaster prevention. So as climate change and climate heat and urgency intensifies, we're going to have a lot more natural disasters, which means more cyclones, right? More earthquakes, more thunderstorms and tornadoes. And the ones who are the first to be impacted are people with disabilities. So when I worked at the United Nations, one of the things that I brought to attention was that it's not just, Dr. Miles, about having a better ramp system. It's not just about having better technical support, better preparation for community leaders. It's also about having safety nets, having psychologists at center, because oftentimes what you're dealing with is not just the physical impediments, but you're dealing with the psychological and mental impediments. So when you have a climate disasters, people with disabilities, girls with disabilities are twice more likely to be harmed, are twice more likely to be abused, to be victimized. And in that process, we have to make sure that they are getting as much psychological support and community love, because that is also a part of the healing. And that is something that I feel we are missing right now. And the public sector, I've seen NGOs take this on one by one, but what can we do that is not just the physical, which is important, the universal basic principles are critical, but what can we also do on the psychological, that we can provide the nurture and care for women who have been victims and survivors of abuse as a result of the climate change impediment and as a result of the crisis at hand.
Clearly, every solution has to be holistic, looking from many frameworks and certainly involving many voices. And I have the privilege of serving as the president at Westchester Community College. We have a dynamic environmental club here at the college. And so I thank our students for sitting with me to have a conversation in preparation for my role as moderator today. I learn as much from them as they're learning from the institution, and clearly youth voices are making a difference. Greta Thunberg has become a global voice for grassroots youth-led climate action. And this harkens back to the 12-year-old girl, Severin Suzuki, who addressed the UN nearly 30 years ago. And she had very similar messages to Greta's and also harshly criticized the generation of adults in charge. What can we say about this variety of voices? Where do they best fit in? And are they justified? And again, how can we harness that energy?
Yeah.
Of good?
I think they are justified, and I think they are more than justified. And I think that in the past, one of the things I've heard, and as someone who myself was a young climate leader as a teenager, was that we were isolated and we were put in the corner and we were heralded at these international events where we were told we're the young climate leaders, but our voices were not fully heard and seen. And so it has been a powerful, pivotal shift in history to get people like Greta Thunberg and Vanessa and all of these young activists like Shatta Scott, Jaden Smith, to get them to not just be heard and seen, but to get their solutions to be heard and seen. It's not enough that their faces and their voices are heard. We also must listen to the solutions that they're proposing. And they have some innovative solutions. I have seen that Shatta Scott, who is a young Indigenous leader, along with Jaden Smith, have come up with a way to revolutionize the way that young millennials and Gen Z drink water, for example. They have used their social platforms to do so. And I think it's also time to make sure that that in the UN Paris Agreement, whether it's that or any international agreements moving forward, that we not just have a seat for the young individuals and leaders, but we also have delegations that are truly representative and can be inclusive. And I think what Greta has also shown is that the solution is not just the UN. It's not just systems of governing bodies. The solution is also individuals taking action and ownership in their own lives. She has actually provoked people and compelled people. And I've been in middle of America and I've talked to Minnesotans, people in Oregon and Colorado who said, she asked me and compelled me to think about climate because in the past, I thought I wasn't part of that conversation. I thought that was something that institutions do, not I do. And that young girl that I saw in Sweden, when she talked, it made a difference in my heart. And that's what we need to do is start telling stories that meet the heart.
Well, it sounds like a blend of the iconic presence along with some action really does matter. Carla, your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, so actually, really, feminist climate activists, just kind of going back to thinking about the 11-year-old 30 years ago, feminist climate activists and leaders have been demanding climate change for it to be inclusive and to reflect the demands and needs and contributions of everyone, regardless of age, race, gender, economic status. And, and they really have been taking action, but up until, relatively recently, their voice and agency and leadership have been under-supported, under-resourced, undervalued, and under-recognized. And I think, there is a currently this recognition, and yes, Greta has been a face of that, but I think that the movement that she is a part of, the Fridays for Future, the most affected populations and areas, they are a collective of the most, amazing youth. And I have the privilege to work with them in one of my roles as the interim thematic lead of the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice underneath the Generation Equality Forum, which was actually a co-creative process. And we have youth leaders there that have this platform, one, to have co-created a blueprint for feminist action for climate justice. That's one thing that and then in all of the international fora, I'm pleased to say that just yesterday, in advance of CSW, there was a youth forum, and about 200 youth came together and created demands or recommendations for member states to consider in their negotiations of the agreed conclusions. And I think that the climate justice and gender equality have really acquired a new dynamism and visibility with thanks to this activism of young people. And youth really have the most to lose, and we cannot continue to fail the intergenerational justice. They have the solutions, as Tenzin has pointed out, and they have the drive, and this is their future. And we are committed, at least at UN Women in particular, in the UN, we are committed to giving youth meaningful platforms to engage and a real consultation with them to ensure that their needs are reflected and heard, and that they are actually part of the solution going forward.
Thank you, Carla. We started this panel with my asking you what brought you, how did you become aware of the climate change issues? You also, every one of us brings some unique lens and perspective to the work, not only our experiences. And so Tenzin, you've worked on various multilateral approaches to solving problems, including interfaith. And
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know, how has your Buddhist upbringing impacted your views on the climate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Actually, my father is here today, and he has been a really critical role in my life in terms of my approach to climate. As a Tibetan Buddhist and practitioner of Buddhism, I really believe that the Buddhist principle of the middle way, that no extreme will ever lead to the results that are powerful and that are going to be long lasting. That has given me the perspective of we must fight for the center, which means that not to take any one extreme. And right now, for generations, the extreme has been polluting our planet, indulging in waste, taking and consuming. And now we're going towards another extreme, which is of being more conscious. And I think it's important, because if we do not go on the other side of the pendulum, we cannot reach the center. The other perspective that it has given me is on time. I think in the Western world, urgency is considered shouting and screaming immediately. There is a problem that happens at hand, and immediately you shout and you have hysteria and you go protest in the street. And as a Buddhist, you have trained your mind. I have trained my mind to think in terms of eons. So when you're thinking in terms of eons, things are not immediately reactive. You don't react right away. If someone says something, you're out in the street immediately. There's power in that. I'm not taking away the power of going out and galvanizing immediately, but there is also power in reframing urgency with time. Time, as a Tibetan Buddhist, and urgency is reflected in consistently showing up, and showing up every single day. So I look at, for example, the Dakota Access Pipeline. The Lakota Sioux community, along with the other tribes, were there before CNN came. They were there when CNN was there, and they are still there. Some of them are still fighting this cause now, after many years, after it's no longer hot anymore to discuss it. They're still there fighting for other access pipeline not to be built. So that, as a Buddhist, I've had the training to really recalibrate and not to think of time as in a vacuum of immediacy, but time as consistently showing up.
Thank you so much for that. So Carla, I'm going to give you this last question to try to give balance to that, because the outcome of COP26 in Glasgow late last year, and the recently released report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's clear that if we don't act collectively now, the world will face catastrophic consequences. And so we feel that fierce urgency of now. So the work at the international level has seen mixed reviews from its critics and proponents. Tell us why you feel positive about what's occurred in Glasgow and the recommendations of the IPCC.
Thanks so much, Belinda, and thanks, Tenzin, so much for sharing that experience. I just want to build just a bit on that, particularly because as I had shared, I did live on the Standing Rock Reservation as a child, and so the idea of time, building on that the idea that the Lakota, their actions are for 7 generations beyond them, and so I think, but as Dr. Miles is pointing out, there is that tension, because there is there is a need for alarm bells because of the evidence that we have. And so, the evidence I'll first jump into the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change most recent report from this last week that focuses on adaptation. Basically, the United Nations Secretary General called that an atlas for human suffering. An atlas for human suffering, and that the stakes of our planet have never been higher, that approximately 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change and disasters. But to temper that, I will say that the report also covers those solutions and how adaptation can help us to lower the risks and reduce vulnerability. But there are limits. So beyond certain temperatures, adaptation is no longer possible for some species. And so I think that, the positive is that this report is a blueprint for our future on this planet. It recognizes the interdependence of climate and ecosystems and biodiversity and people. And I think that there's hope in there is hope that we can still grab onto of one, having the evidence we need to continue our advocacy of these shifts, and that kind of then goes back to Tenzin's point of the middle ground of training ourselves to think about the generations ahead and move steadily, but swiftly towards this. And I would say we can be also very hopeful of some of the outcomes on COP26, of course, which took place under very, very unique circumstances and diminished delegations. But I think we can be really proud that there was a strong focus outside of the negotiations on the linkages between gender equality and climate action. We saw the launch of the Glasgow Women's Leadership Statement on Gender Equality and Climate Change, really recognizing that women and girls are creating innovative climate solutions and that they're disproportionately affected.
Yeah.
And so I think that we can really stay, remain hopeful that that we do have lots of avenues, and I think we're starting to coalesce and have a global community that is moving towards this.
I'll also add to this that I think it's a false dichotomy that is being presented, where I think it is possible to believe in 7 generations and still act immediately. And it's actually a notion of that was taught by colonialism, that there is a duality. There is not. Indigenous wisdom always says incorporate and integrate both, that you can act as rushed and as hurried and as quick and still be as slow. The other point I also want to make is the plant worked with the Vatican on the Pope's Laudato Si, where the Vatican, for the first time in generations, has brought together a group of interfaith leaders, including the leaders of the Buddhist faith, Islam, Hinduism, last year, to announce its first ever proponents of climate change, to be able to make sure that these interfaith leaders are also at the forefront of climate, because we all as human beings move with our faith and our beliefs first. And then action comes later. And so to have these faith leaders and to have people like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Pope discuss the importance of climate for their faith, to make sure that they are also taking actionable steps for their churches, for their mosques, for their temples to be integrative. I think that is a really important step. And last year was the first gathering that ever happened of interfaith gathering with 70 plus faith leaders.
Well, that might be a perfect segue to our questions, because you've stimulated lots of thinking from participants in today's panel. And I'd like to recognize a question from Judith Clark, which ties into your comments there, Tenzin. She believes in climate change and wonders how we can explain the changes that the Earth has gone through for millions of years. So is an interfaith approach or another approach something that might be helpful in that regard?
In terms of the way that, Earth's for millions of years, I mean, scientists are still not 100% agreeing on whether or not there were, A approaches that worked or B, but yes, of course, Earth has gone through its process of losing multiple species, of hominoids changing. So science and secularism has a really critical place here, and I lead with that. However, at the same time, there is no unquestionable fact that in the last 200,000 years, that human activity, humanoid activity has led to a heating that is unprecedented. Generally, if you look at scientists, you see Bill Murray and others agreeing that the heating process for millions of years before, or hundreds of thousands of years before, have taken a longer spread of time. And there is right now, because of the carbon emissions, because of the fact that we are not carbon sinking, there has been a heating up that is undisputable, that over 98% of scientists, social scientists, physicists, chemists agree, is because of our actions. So that's undisputable.
Thank you. Carla, Sean Augustine wants to know how COVID is impacting this work. Your comments, please.
Excellent question, Shauna. So first and foremost, we have been at UN Women, along with UNDP and the OECD, we've been tracking. We have a policy tracker on the gender responsive actions in response to COVID, and one of the things that we is a threading throughout is COVID-19 has allowed us the opportunity to absolutely, without a doubt, understand that crises increase the amount of care for humans that we need. So that's one area that has impacted our work. So we're able then to see that we need to increase our efforts to create social security systems and social protection systems that take care of the people and the planet into consideration. So that said, our work, we've integrated a larger focus on looking at how women haven't been able or have chosen to leave the labor market due to care responsibilities. So that is something that it's impacted not only our work on the labor market and on social justice, but it is also now impacting the way that we are working on climate, environment, and disaster risk reduction, particularly in disaster preparedness and response, of really now having that stark recognition of the linkage between disasters and care. The other way that COVID has absolutely impacted our work is similarly, it has created a magnifying glass on the linkage, the intersection between disasters and increased gender-based violence. The shadow pandemic of COVID-19, where the amount of domestic violence and sexual and gender-based violence increased starkly. And that is a trend that is also similar in other disaster-related contexts, and also in crises, as we see currently in the Ukraine crisis as well. So those are two of the main areas that COVID has absolutely impacted us from a substantive and thematic way.
Thank you for that. Norma Johnson has a question for both of you. She asked, what do you see as the biggest handicap that you face, or impediment, hindrance, as you go about this work?
For climate, I think that the greatest impediment right now that we have is multiple folds. I don't think there's one singular one that I can think of, but multiple ones. I think number one is collaboration. And it can't just be about writing it on your deck and writing in your website, but actually the process of it, the difficulty of agreeing on something, and taking, collaboration in the widest sense. Everyone from the youngest Indigenous leader to people who are not right now advocating for climate change in the private sector, to the public, to intergovernmental organizations. I think that is right now, I find that because we haven't been able to coalesce as much as where I believe as folks who have been advocating in the field, We need to really get around that. That's number one. I would say number two, for me personally, is really about financing and funding. I find that the same solutions that I see are getting funded. For example, soil is right now one of the most effective ways to take carbon and to offset it. And yet I don't see a lot of soil and planting tree projects that are getting funded. I see a lot of huge technologies that are worth tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars that are getting funded to do the same thing that nature has already devised and taught us how to do. So I believe right now there is a competition of crisis in terms of priorities for what are getting funded in the private sector. And I really want more voices of people who are on the front lines to be funded.
Carla, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just, it's a really great point, Tenzin, and that's something that we're certainly focused not only in the context of CSW and UN Women's work, but also in, it is a pillar of the blueprint of the Feminist Action for Climate Justice, is access to finance for women-led and youth-led organizations, and also Indigenous-led organizations, and really trying to shift that narrative about the returning back and the importance of uplifting ancestral knowledge and practices. But I would just add that the other element for us, and I wrote down, Dr. Miles, I'll have to use this again, but we need to inspect what we expect. And data is a huge element for us because we continue to tell the stories and share that we know mostly right now anecdotally of the distinct and differentiated impacts, but not only that, but we have, you know, emerging evidence of the roles that women and girls are playing, but we need to continuously have funding and investments in sex disaggregated, I mean, not just data disaggregated by age, sex, disability, migratory status, to be able to really have effective policy responses. We are pushing for greater investments in data.
Well, as a woman in a leadership role and one who has taught leadership, I am in awe of of the leadership model that each of you presents and that you bring to this work. There is a question here from Hiba Haber that asks, what is one leadership attribute that grounds you in a world where the majority of leadership is male-oriented? Tenzin, would you start us off?
That's a really good question. And one that I'm thinking deeply about. I think one of the virtues that I think Maya Angelou talked about that was the most important virtue was courage. She said, because without courage, you cannot practice any of the other virtues, including love. And so I would say that, and when I mean being courageous, I don't mean just speaking the loudest and being the loudest in the voice, but I mean being courageous in terms of stepping down and being quiet when you seem to know the answer, stepping down and actually listening provocatively, and thinking provocatively, and doing something and doing leadership and managing in a way that tests your own abilities. I think that is courage to me. Courage to me is really the whisper in your voice that you hear. It's not the loud voice, the loud conscience, but it's the whisper that tells you every day to wake up, to brush your teeth, to go and fight the hard fight, to go and do what is difficult. And I admire that above all else, because I think in our culture, sometimes we see as courage as being the boldest, the bravest, the loudest, but I find that it's people who have been doing this work quietly behind the scenes. And some of these women I know who, after 7 days of working another job, 9 to 7, they go and do climate at 7 p.m. at night on Monday, because that's the thing that they're passionate about. They go take on an extra job on the weekend because that's the courage, that's the whisper that's telling them, do this for yourself and for your planet.
that was beautiful, Tenzin. And I would actually just add, you know, for us, we're really trying to continuously define feminist leadership and feminist principles of leadership. And one element, in addition to the beautiful words of Tenzin and also of Dan on the 5 H's, which I really appreciated, is actually real empathy and compassion. The ability to it may not be in your backyard, but it is something that we have to have collective responsibility, and that empathy and compassion leads to the idea that this is a global community. What impacts Maldives is important for us, even though they're you know, even though we don't see it and we're not on a sinking island. We need to understand how the planet's ecosystems and systems, our social ecosystems, our political, economic, that these are all integrated, and that that we're a collective community, and we need to lead with courage, with feminist principles of humility and heart and empathy and compassion.
So these are some new words that are coming into the leadership fold and into the really pragmatic outcomes of what happens relative to sustainability and climate control. And our own Marsha Brewster has posed a question related to this. How can women activists convince climate deniers and corporations that net negative energy buildings and transport, clean water, and protection of our oceans are good for their businesses in the future and the future of the planet? Both and.
I'll start. So I think that I don't have the figures in front of me, but there's one strategy or tactic that's being used right now for you know, to kind of bring people to the other side, if you will, and it is using economic arguments. And using economic arguments, we have, and I would highly recommend everyone, I had shared this with Marsha, but a podcast called Outrage and Optimism, which has Cristina Figueres as a host. But within that, there's and all sorts of other sources, I'm just using this, but the cost of inaction is so much more than the cost of action. I think it was, I think it was about at least double. So that's one of, you know, it's a strategic approach to those who respond to economics without, you know, you don't have to instrumentalize in any way or take away from the real human rights-based approach and a feminist approach that we're taking, but being able to flip arguments and possibly reach maybe not the hearts, but reach the minds of those climate deniers, I think is going to be a challenge of our time.
I think Carla, you mentioned a really sound point, and I think the battle here is not one of conviction, but it's communication. We have not done a compelling enough job for, you know, either, I don't even think it's the deniers, I think it's people who are unaware of the problem at hand. Because that is the population that I'm finding more and more needs the communication. It's almost as if they feel like, well, that's not us, that's just the Californian hippies. Like that's what they've been talking about. Because I've traveled in the middle of America as part of my job, and to go and to understand what is happening there in terms of infrastructure and development. And when we don't make a compelling argument for how an individual's life, the food they eat, the water they drink, the air they breathe, and how that is all connected to climate change, I think we as climate leaders and climate storytellers have failed to do that. And so I would say that we need to be more clear and visible in our strategy of sharing the stories that speak to people's heart. So as you said, Carla, the climate activity, the number is actually in the trillions. It's actually, when GDP, it's trillions. The cost of inaction is in the trillions. So when we're talking about the cost of inaction, we are talking about, Carla, do you mind me, if someone that can do, I think, I'm sorry, I'm hearing an echo. Okay. The cost of inaction is so immeasurable. And the number, as I said, the figure is in the trillions. And so it's not just about the economic, but it's the human health cost. For example, in California alone, Pew Research did a study that found that because of all of the wildfires, because of the undeniable consequences of climate, the sea level rising, the folks that there was a community in California, there was still a percentage that did not fully believe in climate crisis. And as a result of the personal life impact, Pew Research has found that there has been a change in these people's perception of climate change. But the question is, how is this change? How is this impacting their lives? Are they able to change their actions as a result of it? What are the solutions? Because people feel overwhelmed, like, what can I do? I can't go and found another company and buy a big building and make it net negative. And we're not asking you to. We are just asking you to be conscious of what you buy and how you walk and tread on earth. And I think those simple steps and those simple ways that we can actually make a small difference is going to make the big difference. Because collectively, every single person recycled, the tons of recycling and the emission is significant. So I think that is the part of the storytelling that we have failed and that we need to do a better job in course correcting.
So communication really does matter, as well as the lived experience that will just make it inevitable for this to be in front of everyone. One of our UNA Westchester board members, Joan Caton, has posed a question about communication, asking whether or not we believe that Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez has put enough emphasis on the importance of climate change. So does it matter whose voice is communicating and where that emphasis is occurring? Or can more be done?
I think more can always be done. I don't think anyone has ever argued with more not being done. So I think the United Nations and its secretariat is really shaping the metrics. I hear sometimes, as someone who studied at Stanford and Silicon Valley, I hear this argument that the United Nations and these intergovernmental bodies are not necessary. And I always say to them that that is false. As someone who has worked in both sectors, we need the public sector to do the diligence research that I don't think the private sector would do in terms of taking the whole level perspective and shaping it. And I think the UN Secretariat has been a leader in at least shaping the policies and frameworks like the SDG goals. We needed to move from the Millennium Development Goal to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think, Carla, you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals multiple times. And I think that what I think could be a recommendation going forward for the Secretariat in terms of doing more is about how do we apply these goals? Because I think the application part is right now is a gap that has been missing.
Carla. Yes, your thoughts.
Thank you, and thanks for the question, and thanks, Tenzin, for your perspective. I do think that, from my perspective, I do think that the Secretary General has been very, very loud, actually, on this issue, and most recently, he has developed what's called Our Common Agenda. This is a very, very important document, which I really encourage everyone to take a look at. It's really his vision for how are we actually going to continue the implementation in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, one of which is Goal 13 on climate action. And within that, he is very strong on saying we need to shift food subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies. There's very clear guidance that the Secretary General is giving. And not only that, but I would also encourage looking at some of his responses to the IPCC reports. and just his messaging, not only to the global community, but to member states of the United Nations. He is very clear and strong on his intentions and vision for us to really move towards sustainability and an integrated approach to achieving the 2030 agenda and sustainable development goals.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you for keeping in front of us the vision of 2030. And Tenzin, thank you for giving us the vision of eons and how what we do will have lasting impact. This has been a most extraordinary Sunday afternoon. I thank you all for your engagement and your participation. Thank you both for joining this panel today. Thank you to the UNA Westchester and the Westchester County, New York chapter of the Links Incorporated, and the Hudson Valley chapter as well for your engagement in this activity. Thank you to my colleagues at Westchester Community College. I'm going to pass this back over to Marcia Brewster for our closing remarks. I've enjoyed spending this time with you this afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for moderating.
Thank you, Dr. Miles.
This has been an incredible conversation, I must say. It was really amazing. And thank you to all three of you, Tenzin and Carla and Dr. Miles, for your brilliance and thoughtful and comprehensive responses and recommendations, and also for your recognition of the importance of the work of the UN. I think for us at UNA Westchester, that is really important, and I really appreciate your recognition of the SDGs and IPCC and all the importance. I also wanted to mention, just recognize a few local leaders who are attending our program today. And I wanted to mention Peter McCart, who has been at the forefront of Westchester County's response to the climate crisis and is now on a statewide climate task force. Nikki Armacost, Mayor of Hastings, my hometown. Sherry Asher, who's in the County Executive's Office. Hillary Fleming, President of the Links Westchester chapter. And I'm sure many of the others of you are local leaders, but I just am not sure who. But thank you all for attending. Thanks to Nicole Butterfield and Colleen for organizing this event. Dr. Miles, you did such a fantastic job of moderating, and these two women had such amazing answers that, I can't get over it. We will have the recording of the event, and I hope you'll pass it on to others that you know. Thank you very much for attending. Is there anything else that somebody wants to add? Otherwise, we will close it down. And thank you to our AV people.
Sorry, Marcia, I just wanted to say that contact information for us is in the chat, and it also includes the web address if you wanted to come back to the video. Later on, the video will be posted there as soon as it has processed. So you can get in touch with us. You can view the video again. I know I'm going to go back and watch it again. I'm just so thrilled with today's program. So thank you, everyone.
And we will follow up with a email to each of you about the program and the link.